Well, good afternoon and welcome again to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Paul Reed and I'm honored to serve as publisher of the Journal of Business. I'm also honored that every month so many of you choose to spend the afternoon with us having some great conversations and discussions. You know, we started this series more than 2 years ago for that reason, because you asked us for a venue to have important discussions about impacts in our community, our business community specifically. And we've had some great speakers with us, including Stephanie Curran, Dr. Frank Velazquez, Shelley O'Quinn, Jim Frank, Steve Scranton, Larry Crowder, Chef Chad White, and so many others. Next month, we have Anna Franklin, Chief DEI Officer at Providence, Inland Northwest Washington, for a discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of our favorite topics. But today, we're very pleased to have with us Vange Hochheimer, an economics professor at Whitworth University, for discussion about inflation and its rippling effects. What a subject that is. It seems we've been living with higher costs now for some time, and whether you're a business operator or a consumer or both, you have felt the impacts. So what's next? What are the lingering issues? This should be a compelling conversation. So let's get to it, but first, let's take a look at this.
A new year starts with new hopes, new opportunity, and yes, new challenges. As we enter 2023, many questions about what lies ahead persist. What will happen with inflation? Is a recession imminent? How will the housing market respond? We know that supply chain restraints aren't as pervasive as they once were, and COVID-related shutdowns appear to be a thing of the past. But as old challenges have dissipated, new ones have popped up in their place. Fortunately, here in the Inland Northwest, we aren't afraid of a little adversity. We are nothing if not resilient, resourceful, and perseverant. At the Journal of Business, we endeavor to keep you, our readers, informed about what's going on in your community. Our staff is dedicated to providing you with objective information on news and trends, with the goal of helping you become more successful on your chosen path. It's time to go beyond the sound bites. It's time for more depth than 140 characters can provide. It's time for elevating the conversation.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Elevating the Conversation. My name is Lynn Parrish. I'm the editor of the Journal of Business, and to my left is Vange Hochheimer.
Hello.
How are you doing, Vange?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a great time to have a conversation about inflation with an economist like yourself. It's hard to get a feel for what exactly is going on. The Wall Street Journal had a story just yesterday about slowing inflation. So according to its reporting, the annual growth in January was 6.4%, which was down from a peak last year of 9.1%, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, you are.
And not quite to the halfway point between, well, about the halfway point between where it was and where they'd like it to be. Help us make sense of what we're seeing with that right now.
Yes. So I guess the Fed is, this is puzzling the Fed as well. And so the issue, at least one of the largest issues, well, energy prices are coming back up, right? And so housing, that's also contributing to the factor. But a measure of inflation that the Fed likes to look at is core inflation. And so when you look at core inflation, you subtract housing and you subtract energy. You subtract food prices and energy prices, and so that is because those are big drivers of inflation. And so what we're seeing is that the core inflation, particularly for services, is pretty stubborn, and so. And especially the measure of super core inflation. So super core inflation just looks at services.
Okay.
And so including haircuts, including, gardening and
Would dining out be included in
that's
that?
part of food.
Okay,
And
okay. So it's not part of
that's
super
not
core inflation.
right.
Okay,
It's,
sure.
so the super core inflation, it's looking just at services. So what's happening is that the wages for those services, right, for those employees, that's rising rapidly, which in turn is translating into higher prices in those categories. And so that's pretty stubborn, and it's not easing and driving part of this inflation. So
Interesting.
so long as that super core inflation is there, we're gonna, inflation is going to be pretty stubborn.
Sure, sure. It's interesting looking at some of the, I'm glad you brought that up, because in the reporting, it was interesting looking at some of the specific areas where airline flights were, had gone crazy, much more expensive than they were a year ago. Food was up year over year, but was starting to slow. We've heard all about eggs, but it's actually all food. And one of the areas that their graphics showed as a big driver of inflation over the last month, or at least growing, was baked goods, which I guess that includes eggs, right?
Yes, yes.
And so, but it was interesting because one of the things we heard early on was houses and cars, and for used cars, the prices had actually dropped a little bit. So it's hard to get a feel for where that's going.
So the expectation, because supply chains are now being restored,
Sure.
so the prices in goods, for example, should be sort of flattening,
Right.
and because that's sort of now right fixing itself in essence.
Sure.
But the core inflation, or the super core, with those services and those wages spiking, that is a concern for the stubborn inflation that we're seeing. And with stubborn inflation, you will see that the Fed is going to continue to increase interest rates to try to achieve the goal of a 2% target.
Sure, sure. And so would you describe their actions as aggressive at this point? I mean, at first they were talking about aggressively attacking it to try to get it under control. It's under, well, I don't know that you'd say it's under control, but it's headed in the direction they wanted. Is that correct?
It is heading in the direction they wanted, in the sense that, as you mentioned, in June, the inflation growth was 9.1%, and now it's 6.4%.
Sure.
And so in that sense, that is working. And so that's why you saw that they started out with more aggressive increases in the interest rate, right? 3/4 percentage points and so forth. And now this time, they just did 1/4 percentage point. So they are sort of still increasing interest rates, but at a slower rate, because they're being accommodative. If they see that inflation is right decreasing, they're going to sort of slow down the magnitude of the increase.
Sure.
And so, however, the expectation is, because of that super core inflation that is driving some of this, some of the, and the labor shortage is not helping, right, the wages in those areas. It's expected that the Fed will continue to raise interest rates, and the expectation is that we should go into a recession mid-year. And then with that, we should then see inflation get closer to the target by the end of the year.
Okay.
And so it's almost as if the Fed is counting on a recession for inflation to let down. And so that's an interesting methodology, I guess.
Sure, sure. Well, another interesting thing was also in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, they had a story where there were some economists who were theorizing that that there might not be a recession or soft landing. They were calling it the no landing. And they were basing that on some of the consumer spending numbers that they were seeing. And as you referenced, some of the hiring numbers that they were seeing. So can we take those one by one? I think I'd like to talk about consumer spending a little bit and what effect that has on inflation.
Sure. So one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that the jobs, for example, in services, right? I'm going to talk a lot about services today. Hair salons and so forth. a lot of those jobs were the first ones to go, right? So now those jobs are, people are hiring again, small businesses are hiring again. And so, but they're hiring at a higher wage. And so now these consumers have a greater spending, right, ability. And so that is going to contribute to inflation. The fact that wages are higher for those workers, the fact that you have a labor shortage is also contributing to that. So in that sense, that's why the Fed is it's looking at that this is a bit stubborn in the sense, and it's sort of almost counting on the recession to sort of ease the price level.
Sure.
And the Fed is expecting that there will be higher unemployment.
Okay.
So right now, the unemployment is 3.4% the last time I checked. And so that is super low. To put that into perspective, the natural rate of unemployment historically has been about 5%.
Sure.
And so we're still having very low unemployment, which means more people are making money, and now they're making higher wages. And so that's going to contribute to that spending.
Sure.
As soon as unemployment begins to rise, meaning companies lay off workers, you will see that spending decline. And so that's when the Fed, at least from the reports that I have looked at, is expecting that the inflation rate unemployment will climb to 4.5% by the end of the year. At least that's some of the
And that's
projections.
the national number.
And
yeah.
closer to the natural rate of unemployment, and that inflation by the end of the year should approach the 2% target.
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't hear this term, or I don't hear this term as often as we once did, but you used to hear a term full employment when you'd reach the numbers that we're at now. I don't know if that term's used very much these days, but if those numbers would suggest that we were approaching or at full employment, where everybody who could and wanted to work had a job.
And that full employment point has been historically that 5%.
Yeah.
And so if you think about a 3.4% unemployment rate, it almost signals that the economy is overheated or that we have overemployment.
Sure.
And so long as we have overemployment, I mean, it's all puzzling because you see that you have the tech sector laying off workers.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And so it's puzzling because if there are massive layoffs in the tech sector, how come unemployment is still so low? Well, that's because there are some industries that are just starting to recover from the pandemic.
Sure.
So the restaurant industry, the services industry, they're now hiring people back. And so while some sector like the tech sector is, right, the unemployment there is increasing, the unemployment is decreasing in other sectors, like the services sector.
So it's counterbalancing a little bit.
Counterbalancing some of that. And so we are, I would say, super full employment at this point.
Yeah. You know, and that's really good perspective, because if you just look at the headlines, it seems like every day we're seeing headlines of companies outside of Spokane up to this point, where it's, gross numbers, 10,000 people laid off, 15% of workforce, and that sort of thing. And so it's good to keep that in perspective with what we're seeing in terms of the overall unemployment rate. Now at the state level, it has gone up a little bit, but it's still historically great. Yeah. So one of the concerns I had about consumer spending, so people are making more, they're spending more, but at the same time, we're seeing some stories come out about consumer debt levels rising. And I wonder if that's something you've spent any time taking a look at, and whether that's something we should be concerned with if a recession is indeed imminent, as they suspect.
Yeah, I would say that is something to watch. That's something to keep an eye on. As you know, any sort of interest rate that's variable, it's going to increase with every time the Fed increases the interest rate. And so I think that is going to contribute to the accumulation of debt, as you're seeing, as they're not able to, not only is food and all of these goods more expensive, right? So they're having to spend a bigger portion of their income on food and so forth, housing and so forth. Now they have to, right, try to make those payments. If they had balances in their credit card, the balances, right, they sort of compound on the principal. And so with higher interest rate, it's expected that those credit card balances will be, right, will be more if they're not able to make the payment plus interest that is now higher. So I would say in terms of the financial sector, we're in a better place than we were before well, leading up to the financial crisis of 2008. So banks are better capitalized. And so I don't see any concern there in terms of the market fundamentals in the finance industry. But I do see some potential problems for credit card debt and just debt mortgages and so forth if we continue to, well, if the Fed continues to increase the interest rate. So that is something academics are talking about in terms of who can bear the higher rates. And typically the poor will struggle more in making payments, whether that is a variable rate mortgage or a credit card or car loan and so forth. So that is something to continue to watch as the Fed continues to tighten monetary policy.
Sure. Yeah, it could be a combination that could be compromising for some families. And the other thing that we've seen is we had a story in our paper recently about bankruptcies and how they've been going down for years now, the number of bankruptcies. But some of the attorneys that we talked to said that they expect them to go up this year because of some of the moratoriums had been lifted that had been a safeguard for people during the pandemic.
So the spending behavior of a lot of families during the pandemic, right, with the shutdown, economic shutdown, a lot of them couldn't go, they didn't go out, they didn't spend, so they were able to save more. And so one thing to note is that interest rate, every time the Fed increases the interest rate, there is a delay in the impact on the overall economy.
Oh, interesting.
And so there is a delay on monetary policy and the impact on the overall economy. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of the impacts that we're seeing in terms of inflation going down has really very little to do with monetary policy. It has a lot to do with supply chains being restored and some other factors that are allowing companies to produce and so forth. But the monetary policy, we're expecting that will take effect towards the end of the year. So it could be that right now we're not really seeing much concern, but that can change pretty quickly as the impact of the higher rates take effect.
So what does that lag look like typically, or is there a typical for that lag?
I think there's no typical in economics. We usually have a short run and a long run. So a short run could be a year, right? Which is when we're predicting that some of this monetary policy by the end of the year, that we will start seeing some serious impacts of the higher interest rates. And so I think now people might be, unemployment is still low, so we still have a robust economy. If you look at GDP, it has been growing, right? The last quarter, I think it was 2.9% and 3.4% or something like that, the third quarter of 2022. And so we have healthy economic growth and we have robust employment. And so long as those two are holding, you're not going to see a lot of the other impacts in terms of, right, when will if the bubble burst, when will that happen? And so, but the expectation is by the end of the year, those higher interest rates will have those ripple effects and we will start seeing a slowdown towards the end of the year.
Slowdown in terms of inflation.
In terms of inflation and GDP, so a recession for sure.
Would you say, the way you're talking, I get the impression that a recession is a likelihood at this point. Is that accurate?
I would say many of us are forecasting a recession just because with inflation being stubborn, higher interest rates, the cost for firms and individuals will increase, prompting them to scale back production or scale back spending, both,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And so that will trigger, the housing market is cooling, as you know.
Right.
And so the housing market will cool because now mortgages are more expensive and so forth. And so we sort of have all of the ingredients that will push the economy towards a recession.
Yeah.
It's just we're not seeing it yet, but once, if the Fed, well, the expectation is also that the Fed is going to continue to increase interest rates. And if that's the case, many people might be squeezed out of their being able to make their payments. Companies, I mean, we're starting to see companies resizing, right?
Sure.
They're looking at their cost structure, they're looking at their profitability, and they're making adjustments to their staffing and their cost to sort of in the expectation of lower profits.
Sure, sure.
So it's almost all the ingredients are there, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you see that rates are increasing, wages are increasing, inflation is not letting down, so you see layoffs and so forth in a recession. So far, all of those key macro indicators are there.
Right.
We're just not seeing it yet in terms of the labor market.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. And you're absolutely right, because when you read these stories about the layoffs, you see the phrase in anticipation of, easy for me to say, a recession.
Yeah.
So it seems to be at the forefront of the mind of many business leaders.
Right, and then also when you look at the financial markets, right, the stock market hasn't been doing great, so a lot of net wealth is declining. And by the way, there's always a phrase, there's buzz out there that the recession will be a rich session, so it will impact people at the top income level. So you're seeing that most of the tech workers make $230,000 a year and above,
Okay.
and that's where the layoffs are happening. And so the buzzword is a rich session.
I hadn't heard that. That's fascinating.
Portfolios are being impacted and by stock prices going
Sure.
down and so forth, and massive layoffs in corporate jobs.
Sure, sure. You know, I completely ignored the fact that I need to ask for questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A feature, because we're going to get to them in about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes or so. I should have mentioned it earlier, but we just kind of dove right in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so please ask any questions you have, and we'll get to them as soon as we're done with our conversation. Where were we in our conversation? We were talking
Everywhere.
about the rich session.
Rich session.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. I'd never heard that term before. And, you know, we've seen recessions, well, in our careers, probably 3 or so, you know, since, and so this dynamic, I guess they all take a little different form.
Yeah, so it depends on the dynamics of the recession and the sectors that are impacted the most. So as we know, the pandemic impacted women more than it impacted men, with
Yes.
a lot of women being frontline workers and working at, so in the service sector and the hospitality and healthcare sector. So they got impacted significantly during the pandemic, more than men, whereas the 2008 financial crisis was more, a financial crisis. So
Absolutely.
men were impacted the most, right? The financial industry is predominantly male, and so that sort of took that shape. And so this one, there's buzzing around about it impacting the people at the top. And we're starting to see that with the tech sector sort of resizing their organizations.
Sure, that's interesting. And we're still seeing, Katie and I actually talked about this a little bit last month, we're still seeing some of the unresolved issues with childcare that are still affecting, you know, predominantly the female workforce to a large degree.
So there's inflation there. Childcare facilities are not, their profit model is different than a business's profit model. And so when there is inflation there, it will definitely squeeze, right, their sustainability.
Sure.
And so a lot of them can afford to hire more care providers. And so then there's less spots for kids, that there are wait lists. And so what you're seeing, and then, right, that with that comes an inflation in childcare. And so what we're seeing, and I was just mentioning, there was an article in the New York Times recently that interviewed a couple from Spokane.
Oh,
because
yeah. Okay.
because one of them decided to stay home. I think in this case it was the dad, the
Okay.
man, that decided to stay home and take care of the children because they just could not afford daycare.
Sure.
It was much better for him to stay at home than for both of them to work. And so in terms of the labor force participation rate, we see that people are exiting, particularly women, because of those challenges.
Sure.
So inflation, as we know, it's part of that.
So as laymen, in other words, non-economists, is there anything that we should be watching going forward, or anything that you have your eye on that you'd like to make people aware of in terms of economic indicators that we might not have at the top of our minds at all times?
Yeah, I would say that super core inflation in services, because it is something that, you have to break it down. And if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you see that core inflation. And so I would say I think that is, and the Fed is watching this as well, because that's where inflation is most stubborn, because we still have many, many companies in those service sectors that are hiring, right, very
Sure.
robustly.
Absolutely.
And those wages, because of the labor shortage, those wages are increasing wage, right? Higher wages would translate into higher prices for goods and services. And so I would watch that and see whether that's starting to slow down, and that would be a good indication in terms of where inflation is heading.
Sure.
And so that is something that when you go to restaurants, it's very palpable too. When you go to not just restaurants, but you go to haircutting places, right? A lot of businesses are opening only certain days a week.
Yeah,
They're looking
it's
for
true.
ways to save on on wages or on pay for workers, because it's just has been steadily increasing. And so, yeah, those core services, that super core inflation, I would watch
Okay.
for
Great.
indication of whether the Fed's policies are working or not.
Well, and sometimes it's not just even now, a year or so after some of the restrictions have been lifted, pandemic-related restrictions. Even now, it's not just that they're trying to save money on wages. Sometimes you still hear about a lack of availability of people to fill the jobs.
Yes, absolutely. So that labor shortage is right. So then you have to entice them, right? You have to offer them more money for them to come and work. And so that adds to their cost. And so then that gets transferred, not 100%, but a big part of it gets transferred to the price of food or the price of a haircut or dry cleaning. And inflation is, right, it will be hard to sort of escape.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Do we have any questions yet?
Yeah, we have a couple. First one is from Lars Gilbert. It's good to hear from you, Lars. And he actually asked this question in two different ways, so stand by. Do you have a local consumer sentiment indicator that you look to gauge how the overall local economy is doing or will do? And then also, do you have such an indicator to gauge how the vulnerable members of our community are doing or will do?
Great question. Thank you. I am not aware of a local consumer sentiment, and I often poke at this data, particularly from Spokane Trends and so forth, when I am preparing for either teaching at Whitworth or giving a talk. Locally, I know they have that at the national level. They have consumer sentiment that data is collected at the national level, but I'm not aware of it at the local level, and also for marginalized groups, I'm not aware of that. The only variable or data that I was able to find, this was during COVID. I gave a talk to the Northern Quest Casino about, it was an economic forecast. And so I was able to find spending by income levels. And so what I found, which could be a good proxy for consumer sentiment, right? People spend more when they are optimistic about the economy. They spend less when they're scared that the economy is going to go into recession. And so what I found was that during the pandemic, the upper income earners saved more, about 5% of their income, whereas the lower income earners actually expanded their spending by about 4%. And so in terms of thinking about consumer sentiment and splitting that by demographics, that would be a good data point to look at.
And we got a question from Brian Newberry. Hi, Brian. Thanks for being on board. With the job market so tight, it seems this possible recession is being driven by psychology and always talking about it. Your thoughts?
Psychology, yeah, I think sometimes right, economic performance can be, just look at the stock market, right? Investors are feeling excited, right? Stocks prices go up, and so those data points are very volatile to people's expectations. And so it is true, part of that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense, and in economics we track expectations very closely, because sometimes, well, not sometimes, pretty much all the time, people make decisions based on their expectations. So for example, we have expectations that inflation will go down to, get closer to the 2% target by the end of the year. That's an expectation, right? If we expect that that's not going to be the case, our decisions in business will be based on those expectations. So yeah, Brian, I think that part of the downturn could be, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we expect it to be. And so, well, I hope you're proven wrong in that case.
Yeah, Brian asked the question much more eloquently than what I was trying to get at earlier, which is that, and the point I neglected to make that I wanted to ask you about is that it feels like we've been talking about the prospect of recession for an awfully long time at this point. Is that just perception, or is this something that has been in our psyche for quite a number of months, if not an entire year?
Great question, and something I talk to my students, my economic students, quite a bit. So if I am remembering correctly, the typical time horizon of economic expansion is about 8 years. And so, right, we all know the business cycles. It's natural to have booms and busts. And we haven't had a bust besides the pandemic, before the pandemic, right, for quite some time. So the economy expanded well over the 8 years. So then you have people thinking, right, when is the bubble going to burst, right? Because we have been expanding. And what are the policies and are there policies that are artificially propping up the economy? Are there certain weaknesses in the economy that are being sort of overcome by policy?
Sure.
So yeah, we have been talking about a recession because we haven't had one, right, after the 2008, 2009. And so, in fact, if you look at GDP just prior to the pandemic, so 2018, GDP was starting to taper off downward.
Mm-hmm.
And so economists are expecting that the business cycle, which is a natural phenomenon of the economy, will take place. And so there has to be a bust period, so that, right, markets correct when they're out of whack.
Sure.
If not, you may have bubbles, asset bubbles. Interest rates have been low for quite some time. And so we wonder whether, right? There are bubbles in the housing market or other sectors of the economy that are forming and may bust. And so, yes, we have been talking about it for quite some time. So,
Any other questions?
Yes, a question from Nadine Burgess. Hey, Nadine. And actually, a little compliment to start it out with. She says, "Thank you, Vange, for always being so generous with sharing your expertise. Our community is fortunate to have you, and I always learn so much from your presentations. I especially appreciate your ability to take complex situations and make them a bit more understandable." And now for a question, kind of a broader economic vitality type question. What do you believe our region's unique advantage or opportunity is in the next decade? In your opinion, what is something we can or should be focused on?
thank you, Nadine, and thank you for the compliment. So yes, I think if you look at population growth and in migration in our region, that has been expanding. And so people find Washington State attractive. In fact, I am super proud of our state in the sense that we are a we're powerful economically. And so we're a powerhouse and people want to live here, not to mention Washington is just absolutely gorgeous. And so those are advantages, a strong economy, beautiful nature, access to nature. So I think that for us, it is a great way to expect that we will continue to thrive, that our economy will continue to thrive. I would say in terms of things that we can do, I think that we need to look at engaging our labor force and making sure that our labor force is robust, that it's educated, and that everyone who wants to work has access to a job, has access to childcare, has access to education. And so that when students graduate from our universities, that they stay in Washington and they give back to their communities and they become productive members of our state instead of going to work somewhere else. So I would say I would focus on education and providing services that will allow both men and women to thrive in the labor force.
And we have one more question from Don Ting. Hey, Don, good to hear from you. If this is largely a rich session, as you coined, this segment typically have reserves and may not adjust their spending dramatically. So wouldn't this minimize the depths of any recession?
Interesting question.
Great question. So what I am seeing just from being involved in the nonprofit sector and charity and philanthropy, what I'm seeing is that the wealthy, they are being very conservative in how they spend. And so they are anticipating, talking about the self-fulfilling prophecy, they're anticipating, and this is why you're seeing the layoffs in the tech industry and so forth, they're anticipating an economic slowdown. So I think that and then when you look at spending behaviors just historically between upper income individuals and lower income individuals, the upper income individuals tend to save more. Obviously, they have higher income, so they tend to save more. And going back to my answer to Lars, what I noticed during the pandemic is that the people that were not spending, that put the brakes on spending, were the upper income individuals, so the wealthier individuals. So when the casino had asked me, so should we expand operations? I mean, and I remember I had visited the casino for a meeting and they were packed. I'm like, you're doing great. You need to expand, not to mention when the economy opens up, you want to be ready, right, to accommodate that pent up demand. And so I would say when when investment portfolios take a hit as they are right now, that the wealthy tends to spend less and they tend to save more. And so especially retirees or people that are approaching retirement with inflation and with the anticipated economic slowdown, I think that their behavior is going to be less spending, not more. The anticipation, which is what that super core inflation is showing, is that the lower income individuals because now they're making higher wages and there's that pent up demand, other ones spending more, and there's more employment in those sectors. So I guess the jury is out on that one.
Great answer.
That's the end of the questions, but if you don't mind, I'll ask one, and I apologize if you have already covered this a little bit, but given that this inflation is stubborn, and knowing the path that the Fed is on currently, if you had a crystal ball, how many months out are we from reaching a target?
Can I just clarify, meaning the 2%, the target for tamping down inflation growth? Yeah.
The projection is the end of the year, just because of the lag between monetary policy and that impact on the economy. And so the end of the year is when they're expecting a recession, right, middle of the year, and they're expecting that 2%, around 2%, towards the last quarter of the year.
That's good stuff. I appreciate it. Even if it's not exactly what we want to hear all the time.
Wish I had the crystal ball.
Well, but it's in step with everything we've been hearing from other local economists too, of course. And Grant Forsyth from Avista was pessimistic about a soft landing when I talked to him in December, and so it seems pretty clear that this is the direction we're heading. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're a home run hitter, Vange. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending the afternoon with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
For being with us. Join us next month. We'll be talking with Anna Franklin from Providence about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It'll be a great conversation, and we hope you can make it. Until then, be safe and enjoy the rest of your month.